if you go and look at how the World Trade Center was constructed, you'll see that the exterior of the building was made of an aluminium alloy. Okay, so that's what gave it its shiny, silvery exterior appearance. Now, as you will also see in the construction details, it had 236 exterior columns and it had 47 interior steel columns. Now, what happens to steel if it's left for 30 years exposed to the air and water vapor? Would anybody like to guess?
Well, I would think that eventually it would turn into iron oxide, but steel is more resistant to that than regular iron, of course.
Of course, correct. So you are going to get, over that length of time, over a period of 30 years, which it was since the towers were constructed before they were destroyed, you will get some rust, which is iron oxide. So for these people that claim to have written a scientific paper saying that they found active thermitic materials in the dust from the World Trade Center, what does that actually mean? Well, what does active thermitic materials mean? Well, of my understanding, and I think they say something like this in this supposedly scientific paper, is unreacted thermite. It's still active, so it's ready to react. Again, what are the components of thermite? Iron oxide and aluminium. So where the paper actually says is, to me, the remains of the World Trade Center dust were found in the World Trade Center dust. In other words, there was the components of thermite already in the dust anyway, regardless of whether there had been any extra planted to actually do any of the destruction. So really, it's actually a very good cover story, because in a sense you can't prove it wrong. Because the materials of thermite were already present in the natural construction of the towers, you can't actually say that there was no thermite in the destruction of the World Trade Center, because there was, but it was actually what was already there in the construction of the towers. So this gives you a bit of a problem as how you would differentiate between the iron oxide and the aluminium powder that was caused by the dustification of the towers, and any that may have been actually in thermite. There would probably be very little way to actually distinguish between that. But even if you go back to that and say, oh yes, well, how can you say, Andrew, that there wasn't any thermite? Well, you just go back to the previous points that I've made, that even if thermite was, you try and argue that thermite was put there, it's not consistent with what was actually seen. We'll repeat those points again. There were no bright flashes seen as the tower came down. There were no explosions that were visible as the towers came down. And there was no heat. If we look at the amount of thermite that would have been needed to take those towers and make them disappear, and they wouldn't have disappeared in that way anyway, but let's just suppose for the sake of argument it did, the heat generated would have been colossal. And we have this dust cloud which comes out, again, you can go and watch the videos. The cloud travels maybe 20 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour, something like that, maybe less. We have people running down the street away from the cloud catches up with them. I've seen at least a couple of films where people are filming this dust cloud and they're surrounded by it. It engulfs them. They shelter under a vehicle. The actual light on the camera comes on, that's used in darkness because it gets so dark. And then the guy gets up and walks away. He's not burned. His clothes are not burned off. His skin's not burned off. The witnesses all report that the cloud was either the same temperature or it was maybe slightly warmer, and some actually reported it slightly cooler than the surrounding air. So this implies even that the energy was taken out of the environment to actually destroy the materials, not that the energy was coming out of the materials, in a hot reaction. Mm-hmm. So all of the evidence points to a new type of process, one which doesn't use heat. And Dr. Wood can, just pick another piece of evidence out of the air. Dr. Wood's got this very interesting picture that she calls West Lake. It's a huge lake of water on West Street, which was the result of a burst water main. And, this was, I think, might have even been on 9/11, or maybe it was the day after, this huge pool of water. And yet they're claiming that there was these molten metal in the basement. So if you've got molten metal in the basements and you've got this huge lake of water, with some of it seeping down into the basements, why aren't you seeing these huge clouds of steam and steam explosions coming out? It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up at all. So again, you can look at all this evidence, and then you can carry on. You know, we can talk about the energy effects and that sort of thing maybe in a bit, but I'd also like to talk again after the break about this Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which has been getting a lot of press recently.
Oh, great, because that's what I want to have you, because you're the most familiar with this, and we need to get this evidence out, the real facts, because this Thermite and this other stuff is just taking over out here.
Because you can handle the truth.
Well, we're back from break here and talking about 911 with facts with Andrew Johnson out of the UK, and I had looked at a lot of these videos, and what is impressive that somebody out of academia such as Andrew Johnson and Dr. Judy Wood have got involved, because we can look at these facts, but when people are more highly trained or research in these areas, and we get enlightened more. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's worth also looking at the background to who's presenting the Thermite evidence and the way it's being kind of, put out there and what's being done with it. We have to look at those things. And for those listeners that don't already know or weren't listening last week, actions speak louder than words. And, of course, what Dr. Judy Wood did, once she had sort of collected the evidence together and got it into a sufficiently how can I put it? Once she'd built a case with the evidence that she felt was sufficiently strong, she decided to confront NIST with that evidence. And I think perhaps she will have described that last week. I unfortunately didn't get a chance to listen to last week's broadcast, but so I don't want to re-go over old ground. But she sort of went to an attorney. And she took the evidence and she challenged NIST with it.
NIST is what, for the listeners, NIST is what?
Yeah, NIST is the National Institute for Standards in Technology, okay. And it's a government agency which kind of, sets various standards for industry and this sort of thing. They've got the atomic clock there, and they sort of keep the official US time, I think is one of the things they do. Okay. And they wrote 10,000 pages of reports about the World Trade Center destruction, which they published in 2005, which was coincidentally about a month before this Stephen E. Jones character came onto the scene, and started this Thermite story. So the timing of that was also quite interesting. Mm-hmm. Actually, probably just worth dwelling on Stephen E. Jones for a minute. We did mention this the last time I came on in October, but Stephen E. Jones is a very interesting character in the way he's connected into this picture, because when you start to look at the energy question in relation to 9/11 and how it was done, you come out with some very, very interesting links. For example, the fact that Stephen E. Jones worked for Los Alamos National Laboratories, and he's also done work for the Department of Energy. And in fact, you can watch a video called Heavy Watergate, which was broadcast in the year 2000. This is 5 years before he came onto the scene of 9/11 research. And in that video, you will see a short clip mentioning Stephen E. Jones and how he published a paper on what is called muon-catalyzed cold fusion, which is a type of nuclear fusion process which he had apparently done research into. This was apparently a way of actually getting a small amount of energy out of a nuclear reaction in a sort of simple experiment, or fairly simple experiment. Now, there were two other chemists, not physicists, chemists called Pons and Fleischmann. And in 1989, they stunned the world with their experiment on cold fusion. And when they published their results at a press conference, because Stephen E. Jones had published this paper the day before, they were going to wait to publish their results, but somehow they were encouraged to publish their results at a press conference rather than at a scientific conference. And Pons and Fleischmann basically were saying, well, look, we can get energy out of nothing, we think, with this process. In other words, we can put 100 watts into this process and get 500 watts of energy out. And of course, the scientific world went absolutely crazy at this idea, because that breaks the, I think it's the second law of thermodynamics. I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head without checking. But this breaks the laws of physics, so they were really laid into, and there was a very strong effort to discredit them. And Stephen E. Jones was involved in this effort, actually, and Dr. Eugene Malov, who was another, he was actually a science writer at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He got involved in documenting the cold fusion, affair, really, and he wrote this Pulitzer Prize. It was either nominated for a Pulitzer Prize book in 1991, and it's called Fire from Ice. And in this book, which I have a copy of and I've read it, Stephen E. Jones is mentioned on 100 pages. And Stephen E. Jones didn't say cold fusion wasn't real, just like he doesn't say the official story of 9/11 is true. But what he did say is that you would never get any useful energy out of a cold fusion process. You know, it was only of sort of academic interest, and it was of no practical value. That's essentially what he said. I'm not quoting him verbatim, but that's what was the position that he maintained over the years. So he was able to act as a kind of, shepherd in the academic community for all those people who wanted to say, no, we can't be having this energy from nowhere business. We've got to stick to fossil fuels and hot fusion, because the hot fusion program is worth billions. I don't know how much they spent on it now, probably $100 billion over the years, probably more. Because of the hot fusion program uses a completely different and very, very complicated process. Uh-huh. So Steve Jones was really, I think, there to protect the interests of the hot fusion program and stop us from realizing that basically, as Tesla found, energy is everywhere, and it's radiant energy, and we can get as much energy as we need from the environment without burning any fossil fuel, without damaging the environment. We just need the right equipment to do it. And that's what Tesla had worked on, and that's what J.P. Morgan ended up pulling the funding from Tesla's project for what's called radiant energy and this sort of thing. So people can read about that separately. So we've got the energy connection through Stephen E. Jones, through Eugene Malov, who ended up dead in 2004, just before he was due to go and do a presentation towards, I think, a congressional committee about free energy devices. And this was about, how long? Just over a year before Steve Jones came onto the scene of 9/11 research that Malov was dead. And then, of course, we have the connection, as I think I might have mentioned before. It's worth mentioning it again to remind people. Dr. Judy Wood's student was called Michael Zabur, and they were doing an experiment, or not even an experiment, but a demonstration to essentially show that what Stephen E. Jones was saying about molten aluminium, or aluminum as you would say, was false. Stephen E. Jones claimed that molten aluminum was silvery at all temperatures under daylight conditions. In other words, if you heat aluminium up, it will melt, and it will always stay silvery in appearance in daylight conditions. This is false. If you heat up aluminium enough, it will glow orange. And they needed the hot metal, we think, to cover up the energy effects of this Hutchison effect technology, which we've sort of isolated as being the main technology that was used in the destruction of the towers. So that was the energy connection. And then Michael Zabur, just after his work with Dr. Wood posting this demonstration, he was found dead. He wasn't found dead. He was actually shot in a mugging incident in his hometown in the presence of his mother.
Wow.
And the killer was never. I don't think the killer's been properly. Well, no, the killer. If you go and look at the killer's kind of confession, and you go and check that out, it's very strange. They did apparently catch somebody and they confessed, but it's all very strange. Malov's murderer, I don't think was ever found. I don't think they ever found him. Mm-hmm. So we've got these two very suspicious deaths in relation to the energy issue. But going back to the thermite issue, I'd like to mention this Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth group, because they've been heralded with this press conference, and a lot of people have been sending around this press conference that they did. I think they've had 2 or 3 around the world or something. And it's very interesting to note when architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth seemed to appear, and it was actually only a couple of weeks after Dr. Judy Wood filed her action against NIST, or filed the request for correction, I should say, to NIST, which was to notify them that their report was fraudulent, and to dust. In other words, there was the components of thermite already in the dust anyway, regardless of whether there had been any extra planted to actually do any of the destruction. So really, it's actually a very good cover story, because in a sense you can't prove it wrong. Because the materials of thermite were already present in the natural construction of the towers. If you go and look at how the World Trade Center was constructed, you'll see that the exterior of the building was made of an aluminium alloy. Okay, so that's what gave it its shiny, silvery exterior appearance. Now, as you will also see in the construction details, it had 236 exterior columns and it had 47 interior steel columns. Now, what happens to steel if it's left for 30 years exposed to the air and water vapor? Would anybody like to guess?
Well, I would think that eventually it would turn into iron oxide, but steel is more resistant to that than regular iron, of course.
Of course, correct. So you are going to get, over that length of time, over a period of 30 years, which materials mean, of my understanding, and I think they say something like this in this supposedly scientific paper, is unreacted thermite. It's still active, so it's ready to react. Again, what are the components of thermite, iron oxide, and aluminium? So what the paper actually says is, to me, the remains of the World Trade Center dust were found in the World Trade Center since the towers were constructed, before they were destroyed. You will get some rust, which is iron oxide. So for these people that claim to have written a scientific paper saying that they found active thermitic materials in the dust from the World Trade Center, what does that actually mean? Well, what does active thermitic material